Hello, I wanted to walk you through the essay by Stephen King called Everything You Need to Know About Writing Successfully in 10 Minutes. You'll find it on page 447 of your text, and you might want to pause the recording now so that you can get it and follow along with me. This is going to be an analysis of the essay, so let's look at it more closely. This is, of course, an expository essay, one that tries to show us something or teach us something about the world, and one that I'm asking you to write coming up. So it's a good example of what an expository essay looks like. When we're looking at this essay, we need to ask, what is King trying to show us? Also, why is each paragraph there? What is the role of each paragraph? And then ultimately, does the essay succeed? Does it meet its goals? Does it in fact show us something or tell us something? So let's look a little more closely at this essay. All right, so King starts out with the first introduction, which right away is a little arresting, isn't it? Why wouldn't you just start your essay instead of labeling it the first introduction? And when, usually the introduction is first, when he heads at the first introduction, it should make us question, well, what the heck? Is there going to be a second or a third? And in fact, of course, there will be a second. But he reassures us right away by saying, that's right. What this introduction, any introduction, should introduce the topic. And of course, King does that. He tells us what this essay is going to be about. He says, I'm going to tell you everything you need to pursue a successful and financially rewarding career writing fiction. So there's his thesis. That's the point of his essay. So it introduces the topic. He also sets up the reader's expectations in this essay by telling us that it's not going to take us that long. Everything we need to write, to pursue a successful and financially rewarding career, that sounds like it could take years. But nope, according to King, it's going to take about 20 minutes. Even though, and then he adds the caveat, the title of the essay is, it's going to take us only 10 minutes, but he has to give a little preamble. But the rules themselves are only going to take 10 minutes. So in that way, he sells the essay a little bit to us. Instead of this daunting task, how we write successfully, he tells us it's going to be at least accessible. It's only going to be 10 minutes. So he sets us up and prepares us, introducing the topic, telling us what we're going to learn, and a little bit about how we're going to learn it. And then he launches into the story. Part 2, the story or how Stephen King learned to write. And here we have an anecdote, right? Remember, anecdotes or narratives, which you wrote in your first essay, which tells a story. And most anecdotes are presented chronologically. First, this happened, then this happened, then this has happened. And that's exactly what King does. He takes us back to his childhood when he was a young buck writing naughty material for the school newspaper, and how he got caught and what happened and how that became the reason why he's as successful as he is. He, as any good narrative or excuse me, anecdote does, he gives specific details. He talks about the apologies he had to give to the teachers that tasted like dog dirt in my mouth. He talks about the Lisbon Enterprise as being a 12-page weekly. He talks about the amount he got paid, half a cent a word. So those specifics help create the environment, put the reader into the situation, helps us follow along, as does the actual example of the first sports story he submitted and his editor's comments of it, which we have at the top of page 449. Very specific. We can even read the words that were crossed out. And when we think about why the editor did that, we read it before the crossing out and after, and we can see why these edits worked. He also uses dialogue, which helps characterize both himself and his editor, and puts us in into the conversation with him. And as well, he has a point in this anecdote. He's not just telling the story for the sake of telling the story. He's telling the story to help us see what happened to him, how he learned to write successfully. So if we look at this story, because you might think this essay overall is a little choppy. Why is Stephen King, and that's a picture of him as a boy, by the way, why is he telling us all this? Why does he take the time? Well, I think what it does is it frames the advice that he wants to give, right? He gives us, again, an example of what happened to him. And really, if we were to look at the advice and overlay it on top of this example, we would see that the advice he's about to give us would apply to him as a boy. It traces the journey that he took, which gives him credibility. We know clearly that he's an award-winning, highly successful author. So already we're going to trust him if he's telling us how to write, because we know he's an expert. But it also tells us how he got there, and it makes the process seem fairly simple. Those edits seem very simple. Those little lines through the words seem very obvious. But more than that, it humanizes him. It takes us back into his life, shows us what happened to him, and maybe helps us to think that maybe if Stephen King could do it, maybe we could too. So it helps us to feel like, okay, this is not such a hard process. Stephen King did it, why can't we? So I think that's why the story is there. Also, of course, we like stories. We like anecdotes as a species. So King knows that, and he's a storyteller. So he uses this story to introduce us to the ideas of writing successfully. And so then he creates this second introduction. And here he stops the anecdote and he tells the reader again why you're reading this essay. Again, this is going to be about how to write successfully. And he recognizes that there's a sea of information out there already. Thousands of writing courses are taught across the United States each year. Seminars are convened, guest lecturers talk, then answer questions, and it all boils down to what follows. So there's a million different ways to get this information. However, he also tells us why his advice is different. And really he says the way he learned, and again, if we went back to his anecdote, we would see he learned because he saw, he listened, he learned. So again, he does that at the end. He says, you know, here are the rules. It's only going to be, it's not going to be a big deal. It's not going to be a big commitment, really only 10 minutes of your time. The rules are easy, but you have to listen, he says. You have to listen, which means using them is more difficult. Applying them is more difficult. It's kind of like, you know, when you go to church and are told to be good, it's easy to hear that. That's a very simple rule. Sometimes it's hard to follow that rule, right? Well, the same is true of writing, but Stephen King is presenting what he thinks are the most crucial rules as simply as possible in an attempt. Well, he chastises us. You've got to listen. You've got to be prepared to follow these rules, and that's the hard part. So we've been introduced to the essay. We've had this anecdote which explains how King came to understand these rules, and then we've been introduced again, or we've segued from the anecdote into the actual essay itself. So then he comes up with the list of rules, just 12 of them, that tell us how to write successfully. And the first one, of course, is to be talented. And he defines what that talent is. And he takes the pragmatic approach. He says, look, you're talented if you can be paid for writing. If you can be paid, if you can sell your writing, that means you're talented. And he recognizes that there are opposing viewpoints to that. In the second paragraph, paragraph number 20, now some of you are really hollering, he says. Some of you are calling me one crass, money-fixated creep. So he recognizes that there are people who want to write for the art, who want to write to express themselves, who may well be talented and want to write but not sell their work. And he says that's all very well, but the fact of the matter is, if you can write and sell your work, then you are talented. That's the pragmatic approach. Because if you can create what people will pay for, that means you are communicating. And that's really the goal of writing, isn't it? To communicate. And if people won't pay for what you're writing, then perhaps you're not as talented. Remember, this is not about how to write. This is how to write successfully. He also says during this talented section that you need to understand when you're not talented, and it's not right away. It's not after the first rejection. He doesn't identify that it should be after rejection number 600, but he says there must be a point when even you, with so much hope in your starry eyes, understands that, okay, perhaps this isn't working, I need to do something else. But he also reassures the young writer that you will know when it is working, that you will start to get encouragement. Okay, so this whole talented section describes it, describes what it isn't, tells you when you have it, when you don't, and probably is one of the most important, well, it probably is the most important rule to writing successfully. Have talent for it. Whoops. I didn't mean to press that button. I want to press this button. Okay, second one, be neat, because no one likes reading sloppy work. He doesn't spend a lot of time. He gives specifics about how to be neat, but of course, it's like anyone. If you're handed sloppy material, you are less inclined to read it than neat material. It's the same reaction we get if we look at a website and it's got spelling mistakes or grammar mistakes. It puts us off. It sends a signal, maybe even subconsciously, that whoever has produced it may not be as professional, may not know what he or she is doing. And so, be neat. Number 3, be self-critical. So you have to be able to look at your work objectively as much as possible and criticize what you've written. And that's really hard for writers, and he recognizes that, because when you write and you feel like you've got good stuff on the page, it's really hard to look at it analytically and throw it out, because it's such good stuff. It sounds so good. I found this excellent word. It felt so good when I finally thought of it. I worked so hard on it. All those things may be true, but if it's not serving the purpose of the story or it's not communicating, then you need to be able to delete it. And that's, again, that's one of those rules that's really easy to say, but harder to follow. Rule number 4, remove every extraneous word, every extra word. And he says, get to the point. Take out the deadwood. And we saw this during his anecdote when he actually gave us the edited copy that he wrote about the basketball game. You know, instead of the well-loved gymnasium, it's just the gymnasium. And instead of the nightlight quest, it's just the quest. So taking out those words that really don't serve the purpose and getting to the point quickly. The 5th one, never look at a reference book while doing a first draft. So this might be hard if you're struggling to write, because you kind of look to thesauruses and dictionaries and other reference material to put the words on the page. But what he's talking about is kind of left brain, right brain stuff. So the left brain is more logical, more analytical, whereas the right brain is much more creative. And when you're sitting down to write, you really want to be accessing the right side of the brain, which is really good when you're free writing and that kind of thing, because you're accessing that creative part of your brain. If you stop to think about how we spell a capital city, or what the capital city might be, or what another word might be, a synonym for the word you're grappling with, then you're starting to enter into the left side of the brain material, and you don't want to do that. You want to just be able to write. When you sit down to write, he says, write. Don't do anything else. Even put off going to the bathroom, he says. Because if you get into that zone, that trance, where you're accessing, you're into that right side of the brain and you're just going, then you are going to come up with the most creative stuff and the best stuff. Number 6, know the markets. And he gives us a nice specific example. Would you send your kid out in a snowstorm dressed in Bermuda shorts and a tank top? No, because you know the weather. The same is true about trying to sell your stories or your work. Make sure you know who you are sending your material to, and send the right kind of material to the right kind of venue. Again, this is not about writing, this is about writing successfully. And he's not just trying to tell you how to put words on the page, he's trying to tell you how to sell your work. And part of that is knowing who would want to buy it, and then packaging it successfully or appropriately. Then he says, write to entertain. And here he says, don't preach, because preaching is not entertaining. And he doesn't say that you can only write about fun and entertaining stuff. He says you do need to have serious ideas, but those ideas must serve your story, which means you have to have those ideas. You have to think about what it is you're writing, but you have to present it in an entertaining way. Because if your audience is bored, or worse, asleep, there's no way you're going to achieve what you really want to achieve, which is communication. So you have to think about entertaining. Think about writing something in a new way. Think about putting a sentence together in a creative or original way. Think about saying things like, you wouldn't send your kid out in a snowstorm dressed in Bermuda shorts and a tank top. That's an unusual way to talk about knowing your market. That's what he means by writing to entertain. He says, ask yourself frequently, am I having fun? And that you should almost always say yes. Of course, there are going to be times when it's not fun, when it's a slog, when it's just hard work. But ultimately, you should be enjoying what you're doing. And if you're not doing the right stuff. The same is true in life. You should enjoy your work as much as possible. Because if you're not, pretty soon you'll be dead and you'll think that you should have done something else. So ask if you're having fun, and then answer the question honestly. So then it gets into criticism and how to evaluate the criticism you'll get. And he says there's a rule about how many people are critiquing. And if all of the people critiquing are saying about the same thing, this rings false, I don't like this character here, it doesn't make sense to me, then probably you should pay attention to it. However, if everyone's saying something different, then go with your instincts and don't pay any attention to them. So how do you take criticism and what should you do with it? Number 10 is observe all the rules for proper submission. This is kind of like being neat and knowing your market. You know, again, publishers have thousands and thousands and thousands of entries. It's very easy for them to throw something out. So you have to make sure you make it easy for them to accept your work. So if they ask for a self-addressed envelope, provide it. If they're asking for 350 words, provide 350 words, not 700. Understand what the rules are for submission and then meet them. He mentions an agent. Again, remember, this is about writing successfully. He's writing as if the readers are going to ultimately become writers like himself, ones who can sell their work. And he says, don't worry about that. You won't need one until you have enough money that someone will want to steal your money. So he's making a little indictment on agents slightly, but he says, don't worry about that now, just focus on other rules. And finally, if it's bad, kill it. And this is really hard. It has to do a little bit with being critical about your work, but you have the successful writer knows when whatever he or she is writing is not good, is not effective, is not communicating, then you have to slash it. You have to cut it. You have to get rid of it. So let's look at the overall essay. And of course, he ends it by saying, now you can go out and write anything you want because you have all of the rules, and it only took 10 minutes. But again, following those rules is another story. So did this essay work? Was there anything missing, or was there anything extra that could have been removed? I think, and you might differ from me in your opinion, you might think it was a load of hogwash, or you might think it was brilliant. I don't know. But I think he takes the most important most important ideas about how to be successful and makes them easy to read and understand. So if the goal of writing is to communicate, I think he communicates very clearly. At first, I thought the anecdote might be a little extraneous. But then I looked at it again, and I think actually the anecdote is important because it gives an example. It provides insight into his life, which is kind of, it's like basking in reflected glory, where we like to read about the stars, or we like to read about football players and what they do on their off time. You know, people who have been successful, we like to read about their lives. And so to that extent, I think it's nice to see where he got his start, how he got his start. But it acknowledges his expertise by showing an exact example of how he started to learn his craft. But it also humanizes him, making us think that maybe we can do it too. So I think the anecdote is really important. The first introduction, again, I wondered at first if it might be extraneous, because most essays just, if they employ an anecdote at the beginning, they just start with the anecdote. But because he then gives a second introduction, I think it makes sense. And I think because the essay is entitled Everything You Need to Know About Writing Successfully in 10 Minutes, that to start with the anecdote without some kind of introduction might be a bit of a leap and might confuse the reader or put the reader off. So the first introduction, I think, is crucial. In terms of any rules that he left out, I don't really know of any except one, and that is that if you're going to be a successful writer, you should be a voracious reader. You should read a lot because reading helps improve your writing. But then I thought about that a little bit more and remembered that point on knowing the markets. And remember, this essay was first published in a magazine called Writer. So since the people buying that magazine and reading this article are people interested in writing, they probably already are voracious readers because the two go hand in hand. So he probably didn't need to include that rule. So overall, I think the essay really did succeed. So let's look at your task. I want you to choose either Amy Cunningham's Why Women Smile or Joel Stein's The New Greatest Generation, and go through the same process. Identify what it is that the author is trying to show us and look at each and every paragraph and tell me what it's about and why it's in the essay. How does it move the point forward or support the point that the author is trying to make? And then ultimately, does the essay succeed? I want you to write in complete sentences. It doesn't have to be long, but I want you to look at each paragraph and the essay as a whole, and I want you to submit your response in writing by 7 p.m. July 11th. And of course, as always, if you have any questions, send me an email and I'd be happy to answer them. Thanks for listening.